Hey, Katie. We have The Secret at Redgate Farm. Bring it a little closer so you can see better. And we are on Chapter 2, Mysterious Numbers. Nancy stared after the stranger and wondered what he could have meant. Evidently he mistook me for somebody else, she thought. But even so, his actions certainly were peculiar. What message had he expected to receive from her? Who was the chief? How strange that the man should speak of the perfume as though it had been the cause of his mistake. If Nancy's mind had not been occupied with the frail girl's condition, she might have wondered more over this strange encounter. She dismissed it for the moment. Quickly filling a cup with ice water, she hurried back to George and Bess, who were giving first aid to the girl. "Do you feel better now?" Nancy asked. "Here, drink this." "Thank you," the girl murmured, gratefully taking the cup. "I feel much better now," she added quietly. "It was very kind of you to help me." "It must have been the perfume that made you faint," George declared. "A little is all right, but half a bottle is overpowering." "I'm sure it wasn't the perfume," the girl returned quickly. "I haven't felt well since I first boarded the train early this morning." "What a shame," Bess said. "I'll get you more water." She soon returned with a second cup. "By the way, Nancy," Bess turned to her friend, "who was that man who spoke to you by the water cooler?" "You noticed him?" Nancy asked, surprised. "Yes," said Bess, "but I didn't recognize him." "Nor did I," Nancy remarked. "The whole thing was quite mysterious. He simply approached me and said, 'Any word from the chief?'" "The chief!" Bess and George chorused. "What chief?" "I have no idea," the young sleuth admitted, "but evidently it was this strange perfume that attracted his attention, or so he said." "I wonder what the perfume could have to do with it," Bess looked perplexed. By this time, the train was slowing as it approached the River Heights station, and Nancy and her friends realized they must hurry or they would miss their stop. "I'm afraid we must interrupt this conversation and say goodbye," Nancy told the girl reluctantly. "We get off at River Heights." "River Heights!" The girl glanced anxiously out the window. "I get off here too. I had no idea we were so close." "We'll help you," Nancy offered. "Do you really feel well enough to walk?" "Yes, I'm all right now." George and Bess collected the miscellaneous packages while Nancy helped the stranger along the aisle. The girl hesitated uncertainly as she stepped from the train. "I'm not very familiar with River Heights," she said to Nancy. "Which direction should I take to go to the center of town?" "You're still too shaky to walk any distance," George spoke up. "Have you no friend here to meet you?" The girl shook her head. "Then why don't you come for a snack with us?" Nancy suggested. "I left my car parked by the station, and I can drive you back." The girl started to protest, but Nancy and the others urged her on, and soon they were all settled in Nancy's blue convertible. "I haven't even told you my name," the strange girl said, leaning back wearily. "I'm Joanne Bird. I live with my grandmother at Redgate Farm, about 10 miles from Round Valley. That's where I took the train." Nancy introduced herself and her friends as she started the car and headed it toward the Drew residence in another section of the city. "How nice it must be to live on a farm," Bess remarked. "And Redgate is such a pleasant-sounding name." "Redgate really is a lovely place," Joanne said feelingly. "I've lived there with my grandmother ever since I can remember. We don't have the money, though, to keep up the farm. That's why I left home today, to find work here." "Do you have something in mind?" Bess questioned. "I came in response to a particular advertisement," Joanne replied, but did not say what it was. A faraway look came into her eyes. "We simply must raise enough money to pay the long-standing interest due on the mortgage of our farm, or Gram will lose it." "Surely no one could be mean enough to take over your farm," Bess murmured sympathetically. "A bank holds the mortgage. It has no choice. Gram knows very little about money matters, so she takes anyone's advice. Years ago she was advised to buy another farm and sell it at a high price. all at once values crashed and she couldn't meet the payments on her extra farm, so it went back to the original owners. Then she had to put a heavy mortgage on Redgate too, and if she loses that, she'll be penniless. As Joanne finished her story, Nancy turned the car into the Drews' driveway. "Come in, everybody," she invited. "Perhaps we can think of a way to help Joanne." The three girls followed Nancy into the house, where they were greeted by the Drews' pleasant housekeeper. Hannah Gruen had been like a mother to Nancy ever since the death of Mrs. Drew when Nancy was a child. Nancy asked Hannah to make some sandwiches for them all, then led the girls to the living room. "You must be nearly starved," Nancy said to Joanne a moment later. "I know I am." "I am rather hungry," Joanne confessed. "I haven't had anything to eat since last night." "What?" the other girls chorused. "It was my own fault," Joanne said hastily. "I was too excited this morning to think about food." "It's no wonder you fainted," Nancy said. "I'll ask Hannah to fix you something hot." Nancy returned from the kitchen with a tray of appetizing sandwiches and a bowl of soup. Joanne ate heartily. Nancy and her friends joined in, for they had only a light snack on the train while on their shopping expedition. "I do feel better," Joanne announced when they had finished. "It was so good of you to bring me here." "Not at all," Nancy said softly. "We'd like to help you all we can." "Thank you, but I believe everything will work out all right if only I can get this position." Joanne glanced anxiously at the clock. "I'll really have to go now. I'll be too late to make the call this afternoon. Could you tell me how to get to this address?" She handed a folded scrap of newspaper to Nancy. "This particular ad for an office girl caught my eye, since it asks for someone who has had experience on a farm." Nancy found the advertisement to be rather conventional, but it was the name at the bottom of the paragraph that held her attention. "Why, this ad says Riverside Heights!" she exclaimed. "You should have stayed on the train until the next stop." "I thought Riverside Heights and River Heights were the same place!" Joanne Bird cried in distressed surprise. "Riverside Heights is only a few miles away," Nancy explained, "and the names are confusing, even to people who live near here, so it's a natural mistake." "Oh dear, I don't know what to do now," Joanne said anxiously. "If I don't apply for that position this afternoon, I'll probably lose my chance of getting it." Nancy had taken a liking to the girl and wanted to help her. Not only was Joanne half sick from lack of food, but she had worked herself into a nervous state. "You must let me drive you to Riverside Heights," Nancy insisted. "It'll only take 15 minutes, and you'll have plenty of time to apply for the position." Joanne's face brightened instantly, but she was reluctant to accept the favor. "I've really troubled you enough." "Nonsense! We'll start right away." Nancy turned to Bess and George. "Want to come along?" Bess and George both declined, since they were expected home. The cousins gathered up their packages, and all the girls went to the car. Nancy dropped Bess and George at their own homes, then took the highway leading to the next city. "I do hope I get there in time," Joanne said worriedly. "The job will mean so much to Graham and me." "You'll get there," Nancy assured her. "Have you ever applied for a job before?" "No, I've always helped Graham run the farm until now," Joanne explained. "I felt I was more needed there than anywhere else. We keep a farm hand, but a great deal of work still falls upon me." The girls soon reached Riverside Heights, and Nancy had no trouble finding the address mentioned in the advertisement. It was in a run-down section of the city, but Nancy did not mention this to her companion. "Here we are," Nancy said cheerfully, stopping the car in front of a dingy-looking office building. Joanne made no move to get out of the car, but sat nervously pressing her hands together. "I am a terrible coward," she confessed. "I don't know what in the world to say when I go in. I wish you'd come with me." "I'd be glad to," said Nancy, as she turned off the ignition and locked the car. They entered the building. There was no elevator, so the girls climbed the dimly lighted stairway to the 3rd floor. Soon they came to room 305, which had been mentioned in the advertisement. "There's no name on the door," Nancy observed, "but this must be the right place." As they stepped into the reception room, Nancy noted that it was dirty and drab. The two girls glanced at each other, exchanging expressions of disappointment. At that moment, a man came from the inner office and surveyed the girls sharply. He was tall and wiry, with hostile, penetrating eyes and harsh features. His suit was bold in pattern and color, and his necktie was gaudy. "Well?" he demanded coldly. Joanne found sufficient courage to take the advertisement from her pocket. I saw this in the paper," she stammered. "I came to apply for the position." The man stared at Joanne critically, then at Nancy. "You looking for a job, too?" he asked. Nancy shook her head. "No, I'm here with my friend." The man looked at Joanne again and said with a shrug of his shoulders, "Go in the other room. I'll talk to you in a minute." Joanne cast Nancy a doubtful glance and obediently stepped into the inner office. "Look here," the man addressed Nancy. "Wouldn't you like that job? I could use a good-looking girl like you." "I'm not looking for work, thank you," Nancy returned aloofly. The man was about to make a retort when the telephone rang. He scowled and went over to the table to answer it. As he lifted the receiver, he looked nervously back toward Nancy. "Hello?" he growled into the phone. "This is Al. Shoot!" Nancy listened to his end of the unbusinesslike conversation and watched him reach for a paper and pencil to begin to scribble down a line of figures. This in itself would not have seemed so peculiar, except that he continued to eye Nancy suspiciously. He kept on copying figures. All the while, Nancy watched him curiously. "Okay, Hank," he murmured, just before he hung up. "You say you found a girl? Fine. We can't be too careful in this business." All this time, Nancy was wondering what kind of transactions went on in this office. There had been no indication on the door of what business the man was engaged in, and nothing in the room gave her any clue. She realized now that Joanne's chances of getting the position were slim, and Nancy was actually relieved. She was very suspicious of the whole setup. "I was just taking down some stock market quotations," the man remarked lightly as he crossed the room toward Nancy. This isn't an investment house, is it?" she asked. "No, you wouldn't call it that exactly," he answered with a smirk. We run a manufacturing business." "I see," Nancy murmured, although she really did not understand at all. "What do you manufacture?" The man pretended not to hear and moved on to the inner office where Joanne was waiting. In haste to escape further questions, he forgot to pick up the sheet of paper with the numbers on it. Nancy was curious about the telephone conversation and could not resist the temptation to take a peek at the notation. She stepped silently over to the telephone table and glanced at the sheet. Strung out across the top and bottom of the pages were numbers. The top row read 1653 112 129 1562 16 882 091 5618. "Stock quotations, like fun," Nancy told herself. Why did he lie about it? He must have been afraid I'd discover something. As usual, Nancy was intrigued by any hint of a mystery. She studied the row of odd figures. Suddenly it dawned on her that they might be a message in code. Nancy looked quickly toward the inner office. The door was open, but the man sat with his back toward her. She did not dare pick up the paper. If only there was enough time to copy the code! With one eye on the office, Nancy took a sheet of paper and frantically scribbled the numbers, carefully keeping them in their right order. She could hear Joanne's soft voice, and then her prospective employer talking loudly, and realized the interview was coming to an end. She'd copied only the top row of numbers, but dared not spend any more time on it. She put the copy into her bag and slipped back into her chair just a moment before Joanne and the man emerged from the inner room. He glanced at the telephone, gave a start, and rushed across the room. With a muttered exclamation, he grabbed the paper and thrust it into his pocket. Nancy's heart was beating madly as she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. He stood with a cold look on his face, eyes fixed on Nancy.